A public meeting of the members of the City Council of the City of Cottonwood. It is a special meeting open to the public on June 18th, 2013 at 4 p.m. at the Cottonwood Council Chambers Building. City Clerk, please take the roll.
Councilmember Dowling?
Here.
Councilmember Alinsky?
Here.
Councilmember Garrison?
Here.
Councilmember Howard is absent. Councilmember Pratt?
Here.
Vice Mayor Piper? Here. Mayor Jones?
Here. Item number 3 is presentation by representatives of the United States Geological Survey, USGS, Arizona Water Science Center regarding the results of the Northern Arizona Regional Groundwater Flow Model scenario runs for the Verde Valley. And Mr. Bartosh, are you going to introduce this item, or Mr. Whitmer?
I would turn it over to Mr. Whitmer.
Okay. We'd just like to welcome the USGS. Thank you for taking time out to be here today.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and Council. Today, we have the esteemed privilege to have the U.S. Geological Survey here. For most of you know that U.S. Geological Survey actually initiated a comprehensive groundwater study at the request of ADWR and the Yavapai County Water Advisory Committee back in 2000. And we finished the actual conceptual model report in 2005, and then immediately went into developing a groundwater flow model, which was completed in 2010? 2011. They were requested by the Verde River Basin Partnership, I'm assuming, to actually develop or run 3 different scenarios on the groundwater flow model that was developed as a part of that effort. On April 11th of this year, they actually presented the findings of those 3 model runs, and that's what they're here today, is to present kind of that presentation they made on April 11th. With that, I'll turn it over to Jim Leanhouse, I'm assuming. Jim is the acting director, or are you now official?
No, it's acting.
Okay, you see, acting director of the Arizona Water Science Center down in Tucson, and he's accompanied by Brad Garner out of the Flagstaff office, and Bob Hart out of the Flagstaff office as well. I don't know if Bob will be saying anything. Bob likes to stay in the back and be real quiet. And I think Bradley will probably be doing the blind share of this today. So with that, I'll turn over to Jim.
Mayor and Council, I certainly appreciate the opportunity for us to come up here today and talk. As Tom said, I'm not going to be doing most of the talking. That'll be Brad Garner. But I thought I'd just do a little introduction. I think it's important to have a little context so that everybody understands a little more about USGS and why we do what we do, why we work the way we work. Tom already introduced Brad and Bob. Brad is the scientist who did the lion's share of the work that's going to be presented. He'll do the talking. And Bob Hart is the chief of our Flagstaff Programs Office, which is the office that Brad works in. So we're all here to help communicate and help you understand the work that was done. So just a little bit about USGS. It's we're a relatively small bureau in the federal government and known often for stream gauges and earthquakes. But we're actually organized into different groups of scientists. So we have geologists and hydrologists and biologists. And I represent, Brad represents, and Bob represents the water group of USGS in Arizona. So as Tom said, we're the Arizona Water Science Center of USGS. Now, USGS as an agency is dedicated purely to doing science. So our mission is to develop scientific information using unbiased methods for the betterment of decision makers, provide information, to provide scientifically based data and information that resource managers can use to better manage the resources. Right? So USGS doesn't have a policy-making role other than our own internal policies. We make no public policy. We have no regulatory role. We simply do the science, and it's done that way by design, actually, so that we don't have those particular roles. We just do the science, we focus on the science. So and as public servants, right, our intent is to provide science that can be used as practically as possible to help, as I said, decision makers, resource managers manage the resources. Right? So Brad is going to present the results of a study. That study was to develop a groundwater budget for the Verde Valley, or what we call the Middle Verde area. And Brad will talk more about that, and there'll be some maps and things like that. Brad's going to give a relatively brief presentation And then I think what might be the most instructive thing to do would be to have an interactive question and answer session that follows that presentation. So the presentation is aimed, and Brad is very good at giving presentations that are not necessarily, scientific presentations that are aimed not necessarily at a scientific audience, but a more broad audience. But I still think the question and answer afterward is what could be very helpful, very informative. So we're here for as long as you want to keep us here to answer questions, and we're excited to be here. So again, we appreciate it. I think you have some handouts in front of you. There's a fact sheet that comes right, let's see, what do you get, Brad, yet? Yeah, so you have one fact sheet that comes from a very general presentation about the interactions between groundwater and surface water. What was the other one? Yeah, your fact sheet. Yeah, so Brad has his fact sheet up there as well. I also brought, should you want them, the fact sheet is kind of the general discussion of groundwater surface water interaction, has a long report called USGS Circular that goes with it. It's actually it's not one, it's a stack of them. But these are available if anybody wants to dig in a little deeper and get some more information, more figures and things like that. So I brought enough, I think, for everybody up here at least. So we're happy to give you those. With that, I'll turn it over to Brad.
Does this clicker move the slides, or do I just need to use the keyboard? Keyboard? Okay. No, that's fine. Mayor Jones, Vice Mayor Pfeiffer, members of the council, this is a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity to get out of my science office and speak to you about water, something that I think about every workday when I wake up. So I do want to apologize in advance, though, because I'm going to try to assume that you may not know a lot about hydrology. Like, we use terms like riparian evapotranspiration. That's a big word. But if you do know something about hydrology, some of this may seem a little familiar. So, in either case, please bear with me. Ask questions. We are, as Jim said, here for as long as you'd like us to be. We're here at your pleasure. Why is the Verde River flowing today? Why would the Verde River flow when there's been neither rain nor snow? So the Verde River's flowing today, as it does every day. It's a perennial stream. But think about that for a minute. It hasn't rained, as we all know very well, in quite some time. There's no snow left. Where does the water come from on a day like today? The water comes from the ground. It is base flow. Base flow comes from the ground, our springs and seeps. Base flow comes from the ground. And humans can change base flow. And that's what I would like to talk to you about today. It is one part of the investigation that we recently cooperatively completed. Now, base flow can change in direct ways. Let's think this through. You can pump water from a river. You can divert water from a river into a ditch, and that will change the flow in that river. That's straightforward, common sense. I'd like to talk about something that is less widely known, but nevertheless just as true, and it is this. It is the ability for humans to change base flow in a river by extracting groundwater using wells out of the groundwater system. But before we can get into the real details, the numerical values of the study, and I do love numbers, I'm a scientist, there are two things I have to tell you about how groundwater works, I think. And again, some of you may already know this, but I know there was a time in my life when I didn't know this, so I hope this is of help. First of all, groundwater is everywhere present. It's everywhere. In the ground beneath us, there are holes and cracks and fractures, cracks in the limestones and the granites, but also every sand grain, every piece of rock and stone abuts up next to an adjacent one and creates a small open space. If you've watered your lawn or your garden, you know about this. This is where your water goes. It goes into the pore spaces. And so everywhere in the ground there are open spaces. And beneath the water table, all of those open spaces are filled with water. All of them. So groundwater is everywhere present. There was a time, maybe 100 years ago or so, when we thought that groundwater occurs as underground rivers, as just certain canals here and there, and you could only find it with divining rods or witching rods. This is not accurate, not true. We know that groundwater is everywhere, so that, number one. Number two, groundwater, which is everywhere present, moves. As you can see schematically in this diagram, I tried to indicate, groundwater moves. Every molecule of H2O when the ground is moving from one place to another. The exceptions are so rare you'd have to practically go to Antarctica to find them, so we don't have to talk about the rare exceptions. Every bit of groundwater moves from an area of high pressure or high potential to an area of low pressure or low potential. Now here in north central and northern Arizona, it is moving from our highland areas, for example, along the Mogollon Rim or along Mingus Mountain, and flowing down as precipitation flowing into the ground, percolating downwards, reaching the water table, and then it flows to areas of low potential, streams like the Verde River, to become base flow. Base flow comes from the ground. So with those two things in mind, you might be asking, well, how do we know this? How do we know these to be truths about the way that groundwater works? Groundwater is out of sight, isn't it? It's not in our direct view. How would we know these things? Well, there are many techniques that science can use to understand the natural world. And one of them, and one that we use very often, is constructing models. Now, in a minute, I'll talk to you about a very complex model, but I'd like to start with a perfectly serviceable groundwater flow model. This is two pieces of plastic, clear plastic with sand poured in them, and some little straw equivalents to act like wells. This is a model, and it is sort of like a slice of cake into the ground. It helps us understand how water flows in the ground. You can pour water onto the top of this model. I almost brought it today, but it's a little cumbersome to bring. I'd be happy to bring it sometime if you'd like to see it. It's very interesting. The water percolates downward in this model until it reaches a water table, and then it moves in miniature form here to areas of low potential, the lake or the river that you see on the upper right over there, or to the edge of the model also. So this is a simple model. It is instructive, but it is not complex enough. It doesn't have enough nuance to answer questions about our groundwater here in north central and northern Arizona. So we, the USGS, constructed a complex model, a more sophisticated model. Ours was not built out of plastic and sand. It's built out of ones and zeros in a digital computer, but it serves the same purpose, right? It represents essential features of the groundwater and surface water systems. And this diagram here shows that we divide the Earth up into a series of grids in the X, Y, and Z up and down plane. And we can simulate wells. We can simulate streams. We can simulate the physics equations that are well understood, that describe how water flows in the presence of pressure caused by gravity. We call this the Northern Arizona Regional Groundwater Flow Model, and it encompasses not only the Verde Valley, but Flagstaff, all the way out to northeastern, northwestern Arizona, very large area. And it's important to point out that this model is not merely not just an academic exercise. The one before is sort of a school teaching utility. This is actually tethered, if you will, to real data. We have a century or more of real hard measurements of the occurrence of water here in northern Arizona, groundwater levels, stream flow measurements, precipitation rates, the character of the rock and the soil, how freely does water move through them, how many pore spaces are there. All of this data was brought together, and this model was tuned, was calibrated, was crafted, sculpted, maybe you might even say to some degree, to match the patterns seen in those data. With a model like this, we can conduct experiments, so to speak. It's not a real physical laboratory, but we can pose questions, and we can see where it leads us. What can it tell us? What can it educate us about how groundwater works? Does a model need to be perfect? Does it need to represent everything about a groundwater system? Does a model of a car put into a wind tunnel to test for aerodynamics need to have an engine or leather interior seating? You only need to represent those things that are necessary so as to conduct experiments on the thing you wish to investigate. This is a clay car. It doesn't have leather seats. With this model in hand, this was the investigation we undertook. So here, we all know it very well. This is what we define the Verde Valley to be. It is a bit of a hydrologic definition. So think everyone can orient themselves. There we are. So here we are in Cottonwood, and we include areas that many people might not say is the Verde Valley, but it is convenient because it is the way that water sort of pours and generally flows. It suits our purposes. And we can ask, underneath this map is this Northern Arizona Regional Groundwater Flow Model. We can ask an almost limitless number of questions. So for today's purposes, so I don't keep you here until midnight, I would ask, I'm only going to visit 2 questions. But there are many more, and you can read as much more about it as you would like. We will look at 2 locations today, and we will talk about base flow in the Verde River. You can see the Verde River flowing from where we've just circled, downstream past Cottonwood, as we all know, through Camp Verde, and down toward the Verde Falls. That other triangle at the bottom is our stream gauging station just downstream of the Verde Falls down there. That's called the Camp Verde gauge. This is the Clarkdale gauge. If you drive out past the old Tapco plant, it's up there. Many of you may have seen it before up there. So we can ask this model, having been well calibrated, tethered to real hard scientific data, we can ask about base flow. We can ask a question about the past. We can say, what was base flow at the Clarkdale gauge, at the upstream end of the Verde Valley, for the last 100 years? And we can produce a plot like this. Along the x-axis is time, going all the way back to 1910. And on the y-axis is base flow in acre-feet per year. A unit I'm finding now 3 years out in the west that is quite familiar to most people. I think but I'll tell you some ways to convert acre-feet into some more convenient units in a minute. So we see a line showing base flow. Now remember, base flow is just what comes from the ground. There are other components to stream flow. Floods produced by intense rains in the summer, in the winter. Those are other components of stream flow. This is just that part of it that is from the ground. And we see that it is not constant. It varies over time. Base flow changes through time. And this is an interesting graph because there are a lot of forces at play, a lot of stresses that can change base flow. Some of them are natural, some of them are human. There was a drought in the 1950s. You can see that manifest. There was a wetter period during the 1970s, again manifest. But also built into this are the effects that humans have had on base flow. The model is simulating all of that. And so with all of these voices at play, all of these things happening in there, we wish to disentangle them. For our purposes, we would like to know, how is it that humans can change base flow? And so we can cleverly ask a question and single out the single voice, the one thing, the instrument that we wish to hear. We can ask a second question of the model, cleverly posed to suit our purposes. We ask, and you see the green line here is the answer. We ask, what would base flow have been at this gauge if there had been no pumps, no humans anywhere in northern Arizona ever? You just turn off all of the wells in the model and it can provide you an answer. It's a hypothetical. Of course, there were wells and people, but this is a way to look at it. You get a line that begins to take on sort of a railroad track. They parallel each other, but this upper green line, this one with more water being demonstrated, is what would have occurred if there were no wells. And we can subtract these 2 things, with human stresses, no human stresses, and produce a single line, one voice out of the orchestra that we are interested in, and it is the change in base flow, as you see on the y-axis. So it's not base flow, it's the change in base flow attributable to human stresses, namely groundwater pumping. It starts at 0 on the left-hand side in 1910, because in 1910 there were no wells or hardly that many people to speak of out here. There was no change in base flow because of humans. But as we move to the right, we see the line going into the minus territory to indicate that base flow has decreased because of pumping. And we say that as of 2005, the model indicates 4,900 acre-feet per year, about 7 cubic feet per second, if you're familiar CFS with that number, of decrease that is attributable solely to human stresses. So it has rained more, it has rained less, plants have come and gone. This is just what is attributable to humans. We have subtracted out the other voices in the symphony, leaving only this as the remainder. We can then turn our eyes to the downstream area, the Camp Verde gauge, as I said, downstream of the falls, ask the same series of questions. get a similar looking series of graphs. Again, notice the railroad pattern. That indicates the natural variability. But if we subtract these two, we're left with just the remainder. And so at the downstream end of the Verde Valley, the sort of kind of the pour point, if you will, of where all the water has gone, the model says that as of 2005, there is a decrease of about 10,000 acre-feet per year, attributable solely to human stresses. So, again, may rain more, it may have rained less. This happened independently of that, and this effect, we like to say it is superimposed on the other system. Other things would have happened, but this is what happened because of humans.
Roughly, what's 10,000 acre-feet in cubic feet per second? Oh, thanks.
There,
So,
Councilmember, that's an excellent question. Here's some convenient conversions.
And I had a question too. So say the humans actually, did you take into account that the humans would drink the water or bathe in the water and then it would go to a wastewater plant and it would be recycled? Did you look at all of the water that we're recycling here in the Verde Valley, all of the water that we're recharging? Is that in this model?
Mayor Jones, that's an excellent question. The model does take that into account. What you're speaking of is, we call it incidental recharge, artificial recharge, the returns from septic tanks, even leaking infrastructure pipes, as much as I'm sure we dislike those. We simulated them in a simplified way. This is we call it a regional model. So what we didn't do is go house by house, septic tank by septic tank, and say, well, each one of them is doing this. We basically came up with an overall coefficient or percentage. We said, on average, over the long term, this much percentage of water in this area of the model returns to the groundwater system as recharge. And we actually put it back in to the system as recharge, into the same cell, the same little wedge that it came out of. So that was taken into account, but in a simplified way. So, as Councilmember Alinsky alluded to, here are some conversions, about 14 cubic feet per second. The other two are just kind of clever, 6,200 gallons per minute, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, about every 2 hours, actually less than every, hour and 50 minutes. The last one, I think, is of interest. There have been some stories that came out when our study came out that inaccurately said USGS says Verde River going dry. We did not say that. Our study didn't address that. Those words never occur in the report. So this indicates that about 12%, the value 10,000 acre-feet per year is about 12%, not 50, not 90, not 100, not 99% of the base flow observed at the Camp Verde gauge. So humans had changed base flow. This was our look into the past. A model can also be used, and this is where it becomes particularly relevant for a water resources manager or for an elected body such as you. We can look into the future, hypothetically. Now, the future is a fuzzy thing where humans are concerned. We are not chemical reactions. We're unpredictable, aren't we? So the USGS, we're not in the business of figuring out how many people are going to live here over the next 100 years. There are people who work on those sorts of estimates, but you can get caught up for a real long time in those. We posed hypothetical questions. We said, well, because we want to just know about the connection of how humans can change. We posed 3 experiments to this model looking forward. So we start in the year 2005. You see, this is where we start. Condition 1 is, again, hypothetical. Will it turn out this way? No. Unchanged, pumping exactly as it existed in 2005. Condition 2, a modest increase of 3% per decade for 5 decades. And condition 3, just the mirror image of condition 2. Not tethered to any specific reality, but just questions we can ask. And I should point out, as it says down at the bottom, for convenience, I'm just showing you, this is pumping rates in the Verde Valley, but we did this, we were equal opportunity. We varied these pumping rates all across northern Arizona because the effect that humans can have on baseflow can cross groundwater divides, can propagate up gradient and down gradient and do some very fascinating things. We wanted to see what the whole system responds like. But we still asked the model at our 2 locations of interest that we've talked about today. First, upstream. This is the upstream Clarkdale gauge. And you see 3 lines here. They match the colors on the previous slide, the 3 questions, unchanged, increased, decreased pumping. And you see that begin from 2005 to 2110, so way out there, there's an additional decrease of between 2,700 and 3,800 acre-feet per year under these hypothetical scenarios at the upstream end of the Verde Valley. Same question, you're beginning to probably get the general idea here, I think. At the downstream end, at the Camp Verde gauge, similar in character, an additional decrease of 5,400 to 8,600 acre-feet per year attributable to pumping under these hypothetical conditions, experiments.
So it's a decrease, okay, additional decrease. Oh, you're talking about the river here.
This is us asking the model at that river. We're asking what will the base flow in the river be over the next 100 years under these conditions? And again, this is change in base flow, so don't be alarmed by the 0 at the left-hand side. That merely means that starting out the gate, there has been no change, and then the change begins.
So if I could ask,
Yeah,
so
Mr. Ulinsky?
you're saying that the next 100 years forward at the Camp Verde gauge will see less impact on the river than the last 100 years has shown?
Under these conditions, now what actually happens, the actual groundwater withdrawals, the actual locations of wells, those are not things that we posed to the model. So it's only under these conditions. So under that profile of pumping over a 200-year period. So that
And so
makes sense.
how did you come up with your population if you said you're not in the business of doing population? And how could you do this study without a pretty good guess on population?
Right. Well, Mayor Jones, that's an excellent question. This is, and I should have explained, this is groundwater withdrawals in acre-feet per year. There's nothing here about now humans are built into here. The only reason that water's being pumped is because someone's there to turn the knob on. But moving into the future, we're not saying anything about population. I mean, again, to be completely fair, if there's one condition that probably won't happen, the only constant in the universe is change, right? And unchanged pumping out for 100 years, that isn't going to happen. It may go up, it may go down, may go up a lot, may go up a little. So there are no estimates of populations.
That could depend on if we get rain or we don't get rain. I mean, would that be, did you figure that into the model?
Right.
And how much, like if a city has some growth, how much of that goes back into the wastewater stream that's recharged back into the aquifer? Is all of that figured in there?
This forward-looking scenario, they're very simplistic. We kept the wells where they are. We just made them pump a little more, or pump a little less, or pump the same. We kept those ratios of incidental recharge the same. Again, to dig in deeper than that and say, well, they're going to build this detention pond here, they're going to pump less here. That was far too much work for this particular investigation. So this is not, as I said, not tied to any specific reality. It is more of almost an exercise, really. Hopefully not just academic. It demonstrates this connection between ground and surface water here in the Verde Valley.
Mr. Pratt?
Yeah, I think I understand this pretty well, hopefully. You are looking at what happens if we don't increase pumping whatsoever. What happens if we do increase pumping by 3%, and what happens if we decrease pumping by 3%? It has nothing to do with population growth, rain, it's just...
Correct.
If we do.
Okay, so you're just taking set numbers.
And that makes a lot of sense to me.
Mr. Linsky?
And nor does this graph have anything to do with base flow, right? You're only looking at pumping. So this doesn't necessarily mean that the river is going to be unchanged, increase in volume of water or decrease. It just means this is pumping only.
That's actually a very good point. In a model, there are what are called stresses. It's a very generic word, stresses and responses. Pumping is a stress. It is an input to a model. The response is the base flow rate. So you're right, this is a stress to the system. This is the input to the model. The output is this. This is what the model said base flow would be under this posed set of inputs.
But for example, if it was a very wet year or a wet series of years, then the base flow obviously would far exceed the pumping or what this graph shows. Is that
right?
And likewise, if this drought continues, of course, it would we could expect base flow to be much worse than it is now.
One of the powerful things about this kind of graph is, remember earlier when I showed the symphony and we focused in on the one voice? This is just about what will happen because of pumping. So undoubtedly in the future, over the next 100 years, it will rain more, it will rain less, climate change will visit us in some form or another. We know those things to be true, but this graph here is a change in base flow attributable solely to human stresses, to pumping.
Randy?
If I'm reading the graphs right, you're showing that the Verde Valley, taking the area between Upper Clarkdale and Lower Camp Verde, will have a larger impact on the flow of the water leaving the river below Camp Verde than the pumping that happens from the top of Clarkdale back over to the Chino. Is that what you're showing? So are you showing that there's basically a negligible impact of the Prescott users on the flow rate of the Verde River?
So this is the upstream area, and you are right, this is an additional decrease. This would be something you would say is mostly associated with Prescott. I say mostly because groundwater can behave in interesting ways. You can pump from a well, and that effect can propagate even upwards in direction. Even though the city of Flagstaff, where I live, is outside of what we call the Verde Valley to be, it is possible, we didn't investigate this, it's not part of the Verde, it's possible for wells in Flagstaff to change base flow in a perennial stream in the Verde Valley. These effects propagate everywhere. But to the substance of your question, it would be very fair to say that this change in base flow seen at the downstream Camp Verde gauge does have built into it the effects of pumping in the Verde Valley, yes. Is that?
Madam Mayor,
Yes, Mr. Bartosh?
if you don't mind, I'd like to, I'm still trying to get my mind around, and I'm not a scientist, but you show no pumping from like 1910 to 1940, and the line is pretty constant. And then, but you show the base flow increasing in the latter years. So I mean, even when you had no pumping, the river or the base flow stayed fairly consistent. But then all of a sudden it actually increases. I don't understand how the water in the river, even if nobody's pumping it over a period of time, increases.
So, believe me, I can understand. It took me some time to understand this, so in only 15 minutes, I think you may be talking about. If we go back
that one there
to this very first graph, right? This is base flow with the full symphony playing. This is with everything happening. And now, one thing, full disclosure, there's less that we know the further back you go in time. So 1910, there's less information, fewer measurements, fewer people, but it is safe to say there was very few groundwater withdrawals before 1940.
But the mines were a huge water user. I mean, they put in 12-inch mains from their wells. They were huge groundwater users, and there's shows no change whatsoever in what their effect was on the flow, which is, I mean, it's just hard to understand that.
Well, I don't know. Do you know offhand if we had much mine pumping data from the active mining area? The model isn't going to show you something that it doesn't know about. So a lot of those mines, I mean, if there's no data, if there were no flow measurements, we can't put them into the model. It is a fair point. I don't know if we have much mining data.
Mr. Leanhouse, if you could come up to the microphone so that...
And I only step in because maybe I kind of understand the question that you're asking, but much of what you're seeing here in ups and downs is not because of withdrawals, it's because of natural variability in the system. We know relatively little in the pre-1950. So in the real world, flow would have been going up and down because we had major droughts and we had higher rain periods. But what we used before about 1950 is what's called an average annual condition, essentially. So we're putting recharge into the model that represents what it would be on an average basis. There's not enough information to say much about how much what went up and down. So you're seeing a couple things here, and one of the things you're seeing is as we get more information through time, that starts to show up in the results of the model. And it kind of underscores the importance of having good data, good information.
So you basically averaged everything from 1940-ish back.
Yeah, it's an average annual condition, not the withdrawals. Now, the withdrawals are what
Right, just the stream flow.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So, but what you're seeing there as a line is the sum of both what was going on in natural conditions and the withdrawal. So it's not as though you would see, that decline there in the 50s is not because of a large amount of withdrawal that happened at that time. That's largely because of the drought that happened in the 50s. But they're in there together.
Thank you.
So,
Vice Mayor?
the incline that Mr. Bartosh was talking about could be because of no more water usage from the mines when the mines closed down. Could that attribute to the large incline on that one graph that you just showed us?
Well, again,
That was a pumping, though. That was a.
Don't remember how much
That was actually a.
withdrawal data we have. I feel compelled to try to get off of this graph as quickly, because one of the key things we did early in this investigation was this subtraction, right? We are focusing just on what humans do, and you can see that with human stresses, with the wells turned on, we see the red line. The green line begins to diverge around 1940. And then you subtract the two, okay, you get this line. Let's just say, for example, you're saying, what if there was a huge amount of groundwater withdrawals that stopped in the late 1950s? Just what if? If that were true, and those could affect base flow, you might expect to see some sort of uptick in this. Remember, this is the change in base flow only because of human stresses. But if anything, or in this graph, going back from 1910 to 2005, there's really sort of only one overall tendency that it goes. There's something going on around 1970. Is it possible? There's any number of explanations for that. We kept this real simple, and we just wanted, above all, to produce this graph.
So, Mr. Helmerson, you need to come up to the... Can't do it from there, no one can hear you.
I didn't want to do that. I'm assuming, I'm Wayne Helmerson. I don't live in Cottonwood. I live right outside of Cottonwood, but I use Cottonwood water. I assume that the question about mines might be related to Jerome. That was the biggest mine in the area, and it produced thousands of tons of copper a year. And you use approximately 30 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of copper. So that adds up to, you can get 3 or 4 CFS out of that real quick. Now, most of the water from Jerome area came from Allen Springs, and the springs all over the base of Mendes. I believe there were a couple of wells down lower near Clarkdale. But, and in those days, most of the water was used to cool the smelters, as opposed to flotation and some of the more modern methods. And I'm not sure about how much flotation was used there. It was introduced in the state in about 1920. So I don't know what happened there, but so perhaps the question to these guys is did they consider the water consumed by the Jerome mine? And I don't know.
Thank you, because that water at the Jerome mine would have filtered down through Bitter Creek and maybe made it to the river eventually.
It had to be intercepted. It had to be intercepted by the mine.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And Mr. Helmerson is a retired USGS scientist, so. You have a little bit more left of your presentation before we invite comments from the public. Are you about done, or?
Just about done. Actually, all I have left.
We'll catch everybody's questions as soon as he's done with the presentation. Everybody will get a chance to speak.
And this is actually great, perfect timing. This is really just a summary, recapitulation of what we talked about. So, again, groundwater is everywhere present, and groundwater everywhere present is everywhere moving. In northern Arizona, it is moving toward our perennial streams, Verde River, Oak Creek, the Little Colorado, the Big Colorado, to become base flow, because base flow comes from the ground. And what we have talked about here today and you have a handout in front of you. It is called Stream Flow Capture by Groundwater Pumping. But that is its name. That doesn't tell you much about what it is. What it is partially this. Water that is on its way to a river, if it is pumped out with a well, you hold it here in your little porcelain pail and you say, well, 5 minutes ago this water in my pail was moving toward the river. It is not moving toward the river now, it is in my pail. I have changed the system. That water will not reach the river if it remains in my pail. So if moving groundwater is taken out, it won't get to where it was going, is one way to put that. There's a furtherance of this condition that also is possible. It is possible for pumping to draw water from a stream into the ground. The Verde River and the Verde Valley is what is called a gaining stream. Springs and seeps contribute more than is taken away, but it is also possible for a well to take water, to draw water in from a river, from a stream. And so just to summarize the 3 points, as of 2005, groundwater pumping has decreased Verde River base flow in the Verde Valley. We looked at the upstream end of the Verde Valley and the downstream end. And looking into this hypothetical future, Verde River base flow in the Verde Valley will continue to be decreased by groundwater pumping. And I think you all have a really good sense of this now. This is the groundwater portion, right? This didn't talk about intense monsoon storm events and any changes to flow there. What we talked about here was humans and how we superimpose, how our one instrument in the symphony of changes to base flow has affected it, the flow in the river. Base flow comes from the ground, humans can change it.
So can we catch the lights, please? Okay, so we'll ask the public to speak. Are there any specific questions that council members have first, other than what you've already asked? Mr. Dowling?
I just saw that up there, and I thought that is true in the positive and the negative, correct? As in, comes from the ground, humans can change it. So far, everything I've ever seen related to this has only been in the negative, in that it seems to be characterized that humans are only here to destroy or decrease the flow. But I think that if it was to be seen as humans can change it, it then leaves the option or the opportunity for there to become a positive in that situation, as far as you can make it better too. Is that a possibility? I mean, or is it only to be seen as we are a negative in the situation?
Mayor, Council Member Dowling, that's an excellent question. The concept of, so it does work in reverse too. You can have a managed infiltration basin that can put water, used wastewater for example, back into the system, and that can move back toward the river. That is one of the tools that a city, any governmental entity, and a water resource manager can use as a way to manage the overall flow in the river. So yes, to be perfectly fair, it can run both directions. Humans can change it. It's a neutral term on purpose.
So
that we've as a city, and with our acquisitions of water systems, I know that there have been some looks at that as far as our decreases in pumping. As far as we're actually physically pumping less from the ground right now than we were prior to acquisition of certain water systems and repairs and things like that. So I think it'd really be nice to be able to, to see if that can, to try and see that in a model somehow, to say, look, I know you did indicate that if you decrease by 3% every year for so many years, you did show a decrease in there, but I think it would be interesting to see if that decrease was, to tweak that a little bit and see if you can increase that, how you could actually gain more from it, rather than just sort of saying, we have nothing to do with it, we throw up our hands and we are just pawns in a larger mix of science. But knowing that we can change it, I think we should try and change it for the better.
Mr. Alinsky?
Do you have on one of your charts you showed that there was the pumping was to remain constant, was to go down 3% or to increase by 3%. So I'm wondering if you have any figures on how much pumping has increased since we have the data available, and what that ratio is to how much the population has increased. Because the population increasing doesn't necessarily mean pumping will increase at the same rate, but there must be some sort of ratio. Did you come across anything like that? Do you understand the question, kind of?
Not sure that I fully do, council member.
Okay.
You're wondering, like, so we
okay, I'll start over.
Just try to get, yeah.
So on the 3% growth, 3% increase of
3%
pumping.
increase in pumping, again,
pumping.
not tied to population. We're
Right.
agnostic to we just talk about pumping.
Yeah, but for example, the growth in the Cottonwood area here, I think we, charted it back, and we grow about 5% a year, population-wise. That doesn't, population-wise, that doesn't mean we pump 5% more a year. I'm just wondering if in your, review of all the data that's out there, if you have come across any ratio of when the population increases, how much of that increase is,
No,
I'm struggling with this. But
Councilmember, I think I get the just essence of it. There is a unit called gallons per capita per day, which talks about how much per capita people use, and it varies across the state, and it is a number that, through resource management decisions, cities can have some control over. There's a reason that it varies, that it's one value in Phoenix and another here and another in Flagstaff.
Mr. Whitmer, could you please share with us what the city of Cottonwood has done to reduce its pumping and be responsible?
Sure, thank you.
Responsible humans.
Yes, responsible humans. Madam Mayor, members of the council, I understand your question completely.
Can you ask my question for me?
I understand. They do not have that.
Okay.
And as Brad attempted to explain, it varies accordingly by city. It's so dramatic that you can't put a single number on that and say, okay, as the population increases, this is what we can expect in our pumping as well.
Okay.
Now, for example, in the city of Cottonwood, I'm going to start throwing some numbers out at you, okay? In the city of Cottonwood, our gallons per capita per daily use before we took over the systems was in excess of 170 gallons per person per day.
170?
Yeah, that's total gallons per capita per daily use.
So that would be commercial.
Which means
all
you
of
take the
those
total
things.
pumped, regardless of where it goes to, you divide it by the population. Today it's around 110. So we've come down significantly.
Isn't that like one of the lowest in the state?
It's one of the lower ones in the state, absolutely. There are a few that are lower. Prescott Valley is right now sitting at 100. Payson is the lowest of any municipality out there, sitting at 87. Okay, Flagstaff sits at 117, last time I checked.
And Phoenix?
Phoenix, you want the real number or the number that they tell you?
The real number.
The real number is in excess of 236. And if you take into consideration their urban irrigation, good golly, they're up in the 500 or 600 range.
They're providing a lot of food, I guess, from farming, food and clothes.
No, this has nothing to do with
It doesn't
farming,
have
no.
any,
This is
it's not including agriculture.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. If you look at the city of Cottonwood proper, what we've done, if you go back to 2001 and you took the water that was being pumped at that point in time by the three systems, Cottonwood Waterworks, Cordes Lakes, and Clemenceau, that is approximately 21% greater than what we're pumping today from all of our systems. Okay? Not just those three, but also Verde Santa Fe, Quail Creek, and so on. So we're 21% less than that if you take that's if you take out the Verde Santa Fe portion. If you leave in Verde Santa Fe, we're sitting at about 15% less water pumped today than was being pumped in 2001.
And why does Verde Santa Fe impact us that way?
Because they're part of our system. And they supply water to a golf course.
Okay, because the golf course is...
The golf course is
even
the
though
big
it's
one.
supposed to be all recharge, that usually never
Well,
happens.
they use all the effluent they produce, but it's not enough to, satisfy the thirst of that golf course.
Can you share a little bit, he was talking about if humans recharge water. Can you share a little bit, either you or Dan, about the system, the wastewater system or the reclaimed water system we're talking about at Riverfront Park, and our thoughts on our goal to recharge both down close to the river and up further away?
Sure, absolutely. What our grand strategy is, Dan and mine, is to basically look at strategically locating recharge, well injection systems, upgrading of our well fields as well as in close proximity to the river. And the reason that is if we feel that we need to support the flows in the river for whatever reason and whatever's causing it, be it extended drought or whatever, we could focus most of our recharge in those well injection sites in close proximity to the river where you get an immediate return flow back to the river to maintain the flows in the river. If the river is flowing at a rate that doesn't require that support at that point in time, we can put it in upgrade into our well field and we get a recycling effect. By virtue of the fact that we collect approximately 70% of the water that we deliver to our water systems, we can get about 1.8, 1.9 additional gallons out of every gallon we pump by doing that recycling of the water if we're looking at well injection. And as far as the model is concerned, this is a first generation model. And it's important to understand that with every model and every iteration of it thereafter, we learn new things. There are a lot of assumptions that go into models. This is a good model, but it's a first generation model. It's not an end all be all, and it really helps us to learn more about what we don't know than what we do know. There is a lot more data that needs to be, or that could be gathered, collected, and incorporated into this model to make it much better. For example, in Prescott AMA, they're on their 4th generation model. And if you look at some of the inputs into that model compared to the one today, dramatically different than what it was.
Are they using this groundwater model?
No, they have the one that was developed by the Department of Water Resources.
Okay. So this is separate from that one?
And apart, yes.
Okay.
But they do look at each other. Yeah, they do look at
And I would like to also ask Mr. Luder or you, both of you, to tag teaming to share with us some of the things that Cottonwood has done to conserve water since we purchased the water companies. I know that we have replacing pipe is something that we do. Our system, how much were we leaking when we purchased the system?
Tom ran some numbers recently, and one of the things that it's not that we've saved 80% of the water we're pumping, it's we've reduced our leakage by about 80%. And part of that, a lot of that growth was in, or that leakage was in the Cordes Lake systems where, because they were joint trenched, a lot of times they weren't aggressive in going after some of these leaks. So we've been real aggressive in, first of all, going after leaks and repairing them as soon as possible. The other thing is we've had some piping we know, and a lot of it's in Old Town we're still replacing, that is basically seeping water. We've had some leak surveys done. One of the other things we did that helped a lot are the step testing we did in the wells, and we balanced them out. We had wells that were being severely overpumped, which is no good for them. We had wells that were severely underpumped. We've also interconnected a lot of the systems. Once again, especially in Cordes Lakes, we've interconnected that with other Cordes Lake systems. We've also interconnected it with the Cottonwood Waterworks system. So we've got the ability, we had areas where we had a surplus of water, we had areas where we were starving for water. And by trying to balance that out, that helped keep the supply a lot more consistent. The rates, there's no doubt, conservation-minded rates.
The tiered water rates.
The tiered water
really
rates
saved a lot of.
Coconino County, when they adopted the rates in 1995 for Kachina Village, actually had, I believe, 8 steps in there. It went every 3,000 gallons. And a lot of it is a mindset change that by rewarding those who conserve and making those who require us to have the additional wells, the additional storage, all that, pay more their fair share, kind of balances things out. Educating. I think the council remembers when we put the drought and water shortage preparedness plan in, and we banned watering from 9 to 5. People basically said we were dictating their life. When we were able to show them that you can lose up to 80% of the water by evaporation and from the wind, and we used the analogy, if you went to the gas station and paid for 10 gallons worth of gas and got 2 gallons, you'd be outraged. Yet we had people that were watering in the heat of the day in 40-mile-an-hour winds. So there's been a lot of different facets. The one thing Tom's really brought to the table is he's taken all this work that my staff's done and put it into numbers so we can see where we're performing well, where we've got some improvements, and the really exciting thing he's come up with is the recharge. You know, I'm not a geologist, I'm not a scientist, but common sense tells me the 800,000, 900,000 that we're putting down Del Monte Wash has got to be helping the Verde River and the groundwater supply a little bit. Groundwater recharge, there's no two ways about it. We're going to put that back in there. So we've kind of, when Tom came on and his ability to take these numbers and show where things are good and where they're bad, really enabled my staff to look at it and see where we need to improve. So it's been a lot of different things, but I got to say being aggressive on the leaks was probably the biggest thing. We had a couple of years where we repaired, up to 400 leaks, and some of those were leaking pretty well.
So I think to answer Councilmember Dowling's question about sometimes you can turn things into a positive by responsible behavior, it seems like the city of Cottonwood has tried its best to be responsible.
And
I might just add that if you want the number on that, we were averaging around 47 to 50% lost in unaccounted for water from that very first year we took over the systems. And to Dan's credit and his staff's credit, they've been able to bring that down to 10% or less right now. So that's huge.
And the other thing, as the council well knows, is the future of Arizona is reclaimed water. The presentations we've made, the WEF Water and Energy Show, people are kind of fascinated because we've been right on the verge of this for years, and it's that last little, getting that nitrate down below 1, and getting the public perception that a lot of times the water that's flowing out of our plant is substantially better than comes out of some of the groundwater wells and some of the isolated pockets we have here.
Anything, Mr. Alinsky?
I just had some more questions for the gentleman from USGS.
Okay, thank you.
Brad.
And we will definitely get to our public's questions too.
So one of the buzz phrases that came out from the April 11th presentation was that the Verde River was going to be running dry. I don't remember exactly what the date was, but after seeing your presentation, I'm wondering how that information came to be. Because I didn't see it from your presentation. I'm just wondering, and I'm not trying to put you in a politically bad spot or anything, but it doesn't seem like we're headed that direction anytime soon anyway, based on your presentation and your data that you presented. So.
Mayor, Councilmember Alinsky, there was nothing in our report or in our presentation that said that the Verde River was going dry. And there are any number of people who can take our data, take our models, interpret it secondarily, and I believe there was an article that ran in the Phoenix paper. I believe it made page A1, and it said that. And that article actually ended up, we contacted them, and that article was corrected. They issued a correction. And I believe what Mr. Loomis, the author of that article, the journalist, I think he was trying to mesh together many comments from many interviewees, and I think he confused some other comments with some of the things that we said.
Okay. Because again, getting back to that 7 cubic feet per second is the human impact over the last 100 years at the Clarkdale gauge. It just seems like just natural conditions have ranged far more than 7 CFS throughout the course of history. I mean, would you say that the drought that we're in right now has had more of an impact than human?
Mayor, Councilmember Alinsky, I wouldn't presume to give a definitive, but you're certainly correct. I'd have to look at some numbers and actually do some analyses. But it certainly is true that natural variability can change base flow, and we have observed changes even in the last few years in the flow you would see at the Clarkdale gauge, like on a hot summer day like today. We see that it is different this year than it was this exact same day last year and the year before that, and I think all are very aware that the last 15 some odd years, with a couple of wet years here and there, has been quite dry. This has been drought conditions.
How do those compare to the 1950 to the 1950 drought? Are we dropping lower than they did in 1950, or are we pretty consistent with with the drought that occurred in the 1950s?
Mayor, Councilmember Linsky, I'm not sure if did we have monitoring data from the Clarkdale gauge in the 1950s? I feel like it started in the 1967. So yeah, we wouldn't be able to do a direct comparison. And I actually haven't done a comparison. We're actually still being in the middle of a drought. It can be a little hard to say, well, what are the conditions of this drought? But certainly we have a drought that has familiar overtones to the one from the 1950s, but that couldn't be quantitative here today.
Okay.
So the Clarkdale gauge doesn't have Clarkdale and Cottonwood and Camp Verde and the county areas. I mean, the data for the humans that live below it, we wouldn't impact that, correct?
Mayor Jones, let me see if I understand your question correctly. Let's walk through it again.
I'm making it too simple, I know.
No,
so it's the data is saying human impact in this whole little Verde Valley area, a little bit expanded over the Verde. But human impact below the gauge would be different than above, because above the gauge, all it would be what happened in the Big Chino, and there was some farming, but there hasn't been a lot of population up there, right? And a lot of groundwater pumping other than the farming.
Mayor Jones, I believe that is essentially correct about the Big Chino. But again, I don't want to speak beyond my expertise. Because you always have to draw your boundaries somewhere. We focused on the Verde Valley. And one other thing just to point out, and it's often a minor effect, but I'm a scientist. I want to point out the nuances. Remember, when you pump from a well, that effect radiates out in all directions. As I said, even though many of Flagstaff's wells, just for example, are on the other side of what we call a groundwater divide, it is possible for those wells in Flagstaff to change base flow on the other side of that divide.
But they have some wells on our side in the Verde River Basin, correct?
I believe
the Wood. Mr. Whitmer?
Mr. Whitmer would know the locations of Flagstaff's wells far better than I.
Okay, all right. So we're probably getting off of your model, so we apologize.
They are in the model, but you're getting beyond my little universe of the Verde Valley for this study.
Mr. Pratt?
So essentially, the water we use could affect the base flow gauge in Camp Verde, but it's not affecting the gauge in Clarkdale. That's going to be affected by activity upstream.
Mayor, Councilmember Pratt, that is to a first order, as we say, approximation, that is correct. Is it possible for a well here to propagate upwards and actually go upstream of the Clarkdale gauge? And it is theoretically possible. There's a lot of vacant land between here and there. But yes, to a first order, that would be on the right track to say.
If I could jump in just briefly. Everything Brad says is right. His study wasn't intended to try to parse those questions out. Right? He wasn't looking at what pumping where had an effect on what part. One could use a model for that.
And I've just been involved into the Water Advisory Committee too long, so maybe that's where, for the past 12 years, maybe that's where some of the questions are coming.
There's a great many of things you could do with a model that were not done in this particular study. Right. So as Councilmember Dowling was asking about the positive effects, you could use the model to look at how does recharge in a certain area have a positive effect on base flow? How does pumping in different areas affect the Clarkdale gauge versus the Camp Verde gauge? But those were not parts of the study that Brad did.
Now, on that line, we're looking at really just a small portion of the overall study, or of the overall model, is that correct? I mean,
Yeah.
the Verde Valley portion is but a snippet of the larger whole picture. So that really, it's a rather broad brush. I mean, so we're not really calculating individual wells. This is a pretty broad concept that gets down into, it's the most accurate we have.
Right.
But it is still a very large picture.
It is a large picture. There are some advantages to looking at that large picture.
Right.
And the big advantage of looking at the large picture is that the whole system is hydraulically connected. So withdrawals from, say, Flagstaff wells, regardless of which side of the groundwater divide they're on, can affect flows here and vice versa. Right? So by looking at a large-scale model, you actually incorporate all those effects in, as opposed to looking at a small model and then making an assumption about what happens on the outside.
Right.
Is it true that we have recharge coming from like the Mogollon Rim and like of 160,000 acre feet a year into the Verde Valley and the Verde River?
I don't have the number off the top of my head. Brad, do you know
Mr.
the water
Whitmer?
budget?
I can tell you what.
You would-
Oh, sorry.
You would need to,
I'd rather hear from USGS.
I can tell you what was presented in Kyle Blosch's conceptual model report, which preceded this Northern Arizona Regional Groundwater Flow Model, and it was 144,000 acre feet of water of natural recharge that was estimated to be occurring.
I don't know where I got my
Now,
figure.
you guys have estimated in your water budget from the model a different number than that.
And yes, thank you. And that number, so the first thing to say is Kyle Blosch's boundaries were drawn a bit differently. He went all the way up to the Paulden gauge,
Okay.
some distance above, so his number would be higher than ours anyway. Within the boundaries that we drew there, the number is about 55,000 acre feet per year.
Okay. That's
Long-term
more to the
average,
Verde Valley.
yeah, within what we called the Verde Valley to be, yes.
Stay here. May I ask a question?
Please.
I'm interested. You showed a 55 CFS as a model output for base flow at the Clarkdale gauge in 2005. But I think if you look at the actual measured gauge at Clarkdale for 2005, I don't think you'll see a flow that'll go even below 60 CFS.
One of the powerful things that we realize that there can be inaccuracies in a model, but by operating in the realm of change to base flow, the absolute magnitudes matter somewhat less. The challenge for this model, and again, Mr. Leanhouse alluded to this, was we had to balance all of the water coming in across all of northern Arizona. So if you look at the entire area, the model performs very well. But at any given well, even at any given stream gauge, there are some that will, there's a cloud of uncertainty around things, as there is with any endeavor. But again, operating in the realm of change absolves us from some of the drawbacks to that. Does that make sense?
Well, I understand.
Okay.
I just...
Yeah.
If I could just-
Does that sound explained? Sometimes I hear myself talking and I don't know if it's...
Can I throw in one more thing real quick? And that is, and I think it's part of what Tom was getting at. But Brad did say this at the beginning of his presentation, that it is a groundwater flow model.
Right.
So we're looking at the portion of flow in the river that comes solely from movement through the regional aquifer system and into the stream. On top of that is a certain amount of water that comes from snow melt, that comes from what's called a bank storage effect. So after a large flood, for example, you can get higher flows that you'll measure at a gauge, but they don't enter the regional groundwater flow system. They're not simulated in the flow model. So you would expect the model that we have to show lower values than you would typically see at the gauge itself. Sometimes quite a bit.
Quite a bit lower.
Right. Mr. Elinsky.
So if I can just understand the exercise going on here is what you're saying, Tom, the question you asked was using your model to show the flows at the gauge that we know about, it shows that according to your model, that it was actually lower than it was existing. And I understand the reasons why, but I just wanted to understand that was the exercise going on.
Yeah, if you go back to the Kyle Blosch report, in fact, their base flow estimates were somewhere in the around 72 for 2005. Just to give you a comparison between the model output at 55 and what was being based upon the actual measurements that were conducted at the Clarkdale gauge for the same time period.
Okay.
So then, so if I could just take the next step, then the other 20 some odd CFS would have been from outside factors. Possibly, maybe, sort of. So the 55 might be, right, gotcha, okay. Just the difference there, all right.
And models are as good as the data that goes into them.
Right.
And the assumptions that go into them. And they're not precise, which people tend to take that and say, it's a model, it's perfect. It's not perfect.
Are there, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Are there plans then, you said Prescott's working on his fourth model, are there plans to continue working on this and tweak it as we go down?
Well, so the most important thing you can have to make a better model is data.
Is what?
Data.
Oh, right.
You know, all kinds of hydrologic data, largely water levels, in wells, groundwater levels, stream flow values, knowledge of how much recharge is occurring, the properties of the aquifer itself. All of that is I mean, that's really how you make a model better. And one of the things the WAC has supported for a long time, continues to do so, is just collection of basic information, basic data. You can see in the plots that Brad had, when you get prior to 1950, you have to make some simplifying assumptions. After that point, we have more data, more information. We can start to get more sophisticated about how we simulate things. So by collecting information, by collecting data, it's setting the groundwork for refined, enhanced models in the future.
And so I think that the WAC has done a lot, and some of these studies that you're doing that help other groups that are studying the river and the environment did come from the WAC. So I think the WAC did a lot of good things, but I think I'm the only person on the WAC that thinks that. So, Randy?
According to the model, I'm going to make things real simplistic. It's accounting for a certain percentage of recharge, and it's showing a certain percentage, or it's showing total withdrawal. So the model alludes to the idea that we're actually mining groundwater right now. Yet we know there's all these other outside factors that are attributing to the movement of water from point A to point B. At what point are we going to determine truly what other water sources are impacting the Verde Valley, so that we can get a true idea of whether we really are mining groundwater or we're not? I mean, this shows that the river is decreasing in use, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the entire aquifer is being mined. If we're getting this impact from the Mogollon, if we're getting the wells then that Flagstaff's using up at Woody Mountain or whatever it is to pull out of this aquifer, if we got the Big Chino that's also pulling a huge amount, because what I'm seeing is basically the only way we're going to change the flow of water leaving the Camp Verde gauge is to pump water in Chino, pipe it over the hill and drop it on the downstream side of the Clarkdale gauge. But that's not optimum or realistic. So I mean, I guess what I'm after is right now this model is saying that we're mining water, but I don't necessarily believe that's the case, at least to the extreme that this model is showing, because we have all these other outside factors that aren't being taken into consideration.
Councilmember Garrison, there was a lot in that, so I'll try to address kind of what I recall. So the model does incorporate all of the recharge as we know it that enters the regional system and comes out in the river. So I think that's what you opened with, was that it accounts for part of the recharge. It accounts for all the recharge that we know in the groundwater system and all the discharge we know in the groundwater system. If you recall that, and this may sound like kind of a tangential answer to your comment, but Brad spoke of stresses to the system. And by stresses we mean things that you would change. You might put more recharge in, you might withdraw water. The natural system might impose stresses in the form of droughts and floods and things like that. That you can look at each of these stresses independently, and that's what Brad has done in this study. And each of these stresses can be summed up together to give you a total answer. So if you want to know the absolute flow that's going to happen in the river at some point in the time, you can take each of the stresses in that effect and you can add them all up. Simple addition, in essence. I mean, literally take a series of stresses and add them together. But some of these stresses you don't know going forward. So we don't know when the next big flood's going to happen. We don't know when the next big drought is going to happen. But we can, using the model, just pick out that thing that as resource managers people can control. And that's how water is used, where it's recharged. Right? So those are the things that people have control over. What happens with floods, and you can't. But you can ask the question, what impact, positive or negative, do the resource management practices of people have on the system? And those are going to be there regardless of the other things that happen. So if there's an estimate that flow decreases by 7 CFS, from pre-development to the development times, that's there whether or not we went through wet periods or dry periods. Right? That's still part of the overall signal. It's one of those stresses that's in the signal. So had people done nothing in the system, there would be 7 more cubic feet per second than there are right now. whether or not there was a big flood or a big drought. Now, the total amount of flow, as I said, 7 CFS less. Total amount of flow depends on how much recharge you're getting, how much big floods and droughts and things like that. But that part people can control, that change that people have on the system, operates independently of those other things. Does that?
Kind of, I guess what I'm after is I'm trying to equate this down to a water mining issue. Are we truly mining the water that's in the aquifers under us? Are we doing long-term damage, or are what we do on a day-to-day basis going to be cyclical? Just, a symptom of what's happening on a grander scale, I guess.
In a way, I'm trying to duck what is a much bigger question. We could come back and give a presentation about something that Brad touched on just briefly, which is stream flow capture. And it's actually really interesting once you get your head around it. So, and I'll go through it just very briefly. If I can do this briefly and fairly clearly with no graphics. So if you have a groundwater system like you have right here, so you have water flowing from a recharge area and it's exiting at a river in this case, right? And you put a well, just speaking hypothetically, half mile away from the river. And you turn that well on and you're pumping 100 gallons per minute out of that well. You're going to get 100 gallons per minute coming out of somewhere. Right? And the only place initially that water can come from is the aquifer itself. So when you first turn on that well, day one, you're pumping 100 gallons per minute coming from storage in the aquifer. In essence, you're mining 100 gallons per minute out of the aquifer, because that's where it's coming from. As time progresses, and this is the kind of more complicated part of it, although it's really quite simple. As time progresses, more of that water that you're withdrawing or pumping will be from water that would otherwise have flowed in the river. And if you pump your well long enough, if you take it out 50 years, 100 years, how long it takes depends on how far you are from the river and the nature of the aquifer itself. Eventually, all of your 100 gallons per minute will be coming out of water that would otherwise have flowed in the river, and you will no longer be taking anything out of the aquifer. Right, so at some point in time, you're mining zero water because your well is on. When you first turn on that well, you're mining 100% of your water from the aquifer. So there's not a simple answer to that question, although it's an excellent modeling question. You can take the results of a model, you can say you're pumping a certain amount of total water, and you've had a certain effect on the river. The difference between those two is mining of water from the aquifer. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, as good as it's going to.
Like I said, we're happy to come back, and we have whole presentations about this.
Tom is...
No, go ahead. That's fair.
Okay.
In a way, it seems like we're complicating this. I've looked at the study and looked at it. Basically, all this model is saying is that, yes, pumping has decreased the base flow at Camp Brewery. And that's pretty much indisputable science. And some people are using it for different political things. But basically, your model doesn't get into all that. It doesn't talk about population. You're just saying, yes, pumping decreases the base flow at Camp Brewery, and here's the science to prove it.
And
that makes sense.
I'm sorry, if I could jump in, Councilmember Pratt. I don't intend to kind of jump off your point here, but what the model does is intended to do is provide, so that it's a solid scientific basis, right? We understand the groundwater and surface water are connected. The question then is, how does that play out? Where do you see the effects? How much effect do you see when? And that's what a model can do to help with with managing the resource. Now, if you want, say, if you wanted to design a system where you recharge water in some places, you withdraw it others, and you want to know what the effect on the system is going to be, you can use the model to do that. But kind of the basic underlying point of those two things are connected is not scientifically in dispute.
Yeah.
The model helps you with the details of it.
Yeah. And in a sense, we're trying to complicate it by saying, well, maybe it said this, maybe we do this. No, the model, your study didn't deal with any of that. Your study just dealt with trying to figure out if pumping does affect the base flow, and yes, pumping does affect the base flow.
And the how and the where.
And how?
And the how and the where.
Yeah.
Right? And you don't need a model to say that the two are connected.
Yeah.
It's
and the science is there for it.
Right.
Yeah. Very good.
You want to add to that, Tom?
No.
You did, but...
Well, no, all I was going to say
Please.
is, the dispute isn't that there's a connection between surface and groundwater, and if you pump enough, you potentially have the capability of impacting base flow. The dispute is more in how precise your predictions of how much of an impact it's having is where I have issues with what's being presented out there at this point in time. They tend to take this thing and use the model as if it's exact science, and it's not. There are a lot of assumptions that go into this. There are a lot of missing data that goes in that's not included in this model. It is a first generation model, and it's a massive model. When you look at the size, it's basically a third of the state almost. I mean, it's huge. Where I run into issues is when they start saying, oh, it's exact, and this is exactly what's going to happen, and you can't really do that with this model or any model for that matter. So is there a connection between surface and groundwater? Absolutely. Even the courts have come out and said that. So that's not in dispute. It has never been in dispute. And I would just say, you know, models are great tools. They're great for showing you trends, based on long-term averages. They don't have the ability to capture single events or, you know, extended periods of events. For instance, the '93 flood that we had here that most of you may remember, huge, huge flood. If you look at the groundwater elevations in our wells, everything recovered because of that one event. USGS's head modeler has said that the base flow was impacted for as much as 5 years after that event as a result of that one event. The model doesn't have the capability to take that into consideration because that's not what it's there for. It's long-term, based on long-term averages. So will we hit at some point in time potentially 10,000 years out in the future? Maybe. Will we hit 20 years out? No, we won't. It doesn't have that ability to do that. And likewise, same with drought. You go into extended periods of drought, it doesn't have the capability to capture that as well. Just the reverse.
Okay, so if we could get members of the public who would wish to speak. Mr. Matthews, did you want to come up and ask any questions of the USGS? Lawrence Matthews from Page Springs.
Okay, this is essentially my second of this presentation. I did the one in Camp Verde about 3 months ago. Anyway, looking over some, I thought it was a little bit weak in the sense that these three, you were talking about the Paulden stream gauge at that time more than this time, but anyway, that those gauges have not been in operation all that long, at least one of them, and so I was a little concerned about that, and also obviously concerned about what's going on in the Big Chino and Prescott and Prescott Valley's plans to pump that water out of there into those two cities. So it seems like that maybe is a somewhat bigger part of the total stream flow through the Verde Valley than what we're talking about here, but doesn't mean we can afford to ignore this. So anyway, when that Camp Verde thing came up, I was under the impression you were going to be talking about groundwater flow and how it got to the Verde River. So maybe I was a little disappointed in that. So as to whether that comes from Flagstaff or where all that really comes from. So anyway, but I'd like to know when those stream gauges were put into continuous operation. And when it comes to the mine there, I think there's something about the Hopewell Tunnel drains the Jerome mine into the Verde River. It was done for that purpose, so they didn't have to pump it to the surface in Jerome and then let it run down. So I don't know. It'd be interesting to know what's going on with the flow of that tunnel, and that had quite a bit to do with the mine itself, but not the smelting operation.
Okay, thank you very much. So there's probably some GS studies done that would help, that we could send to Mr. Matthews that answers some of those questions about the whole aquifer and how the water moves. I've seen pictures and different studies, so maybe Kyle Blosch's, Mr. Whitmer.
He can come talk to me.
Okay.
I'll give him all the answers.
You have maps and things like that with the little arrows and how things move. Mr. Leonhardt.
Yeah, I would throw in, first, I appreciate your comments. And I have to speak this way, I think, unfortunately, for the mic. But there's a couple of reports I can think of that would address that question, although maybe not quite in the way you would want it presented, but the model report itself, so the report that documents the groundwater flow model, is very much about how water flows in the system, where it recharges, where it discharges, and what the nature is of the aquifers and why it does what it does. I won't say it's coded in there, but the report is designed to document the model, but that information is in that report.
So, and that's available for free on the USGS website, correct?
Yes. Oh yeah, all of our stuff is available.
All the studies. Okay.
So I can give you a link to that. That can be gotten readily.
Thank you. Anybody else like to ask a question or make a comment on today's presentation?
Andy Grosetta, I have a question. I didn't catch it on the PowerPoint, but I think it's a fair assumption that based on your PowerPoint that the Verde River base flow at the Clarkdale gauge, even though it was installed in the mid-60s, I think 66, is 40 to 45,000 acre feet per year. That's the range. My question is, one, did you take the information from 66 forward? I think I heard you say that, and rolled it back to come up with that number. And I missed the number at the Camp Verde gauge as what the flow was at the Camp Verde gauge for that time period from 1910 till now.
Mr. Garner?
Thank you for the question. For the purposes of time today, I wasn't able to. There are tables in our report that show all of those, what you call water budget values. Again, we focused, Mr. Grosset, on just human effects today, but yes, on the order of 44,000 acre feet per year at the Clarkdale gauge, and I believe, but I'm thinking on my feet here, something like 88,000 acre feet per year of base flow at the Camp Verde gauge as a long-term average. Again, it varies, and the model shows that to vary. And again, I would look back at you if I could, but I had to talk to the mic.
So trying to pull the loose ends together, the flow of the river since 1910 till 2010, both at least at Clarkdale, and I didn't see the range at the Camp Verde gauge, but the rivers within the gauge of 40 to 45,000 acre foot per year has not changed since then. And we have blips. We have dry spells, we have droughts, we have wet spells, 93 flood, all these natural occurring events that all impact that. But the range is the best I think that we can look at because it's hard to put a handle on an exact number. But the Clarkdale gauge was 40 to 45,000 over that time period. And whatever the range was in Camp Verde, I don't know. That was the question. The other thing one of the council members had alluded to is the impact for the next 100 years, our impact, according to this study, is going to be less than it was for the prior, since 1910 up till now. I find that that's interesting, just speaking in general assumptions, because most of the activity and development has been here in the last 20, 30, 40 years. And so if we're expecting whatever the growth is going to be, that impact is going to be less than what the impact was during the prior time frame. So that's an interesting scenario. The other thing I just want to say, I want to thank the USGS for doing this. And I think it's real important for everybody to understand that it's the first cut, and it's based on a lot of assumptions, but it's the best information we've got at the moment. The information that was interpreted from your study that you alluded to earlier in your presentation, I think that's something that, I'm glad to thank the council for having USGS come here to at least present the report. They did the report, and for us to hear the actual findings of the report. So I want to thank the council and USGS for doing that. And really my only question is, what is that range for the Camp Verde gauge? That was on your PowerPoint, but I didn't catch it.
Okay. Any other questions from members of the public? No? Any other questions from the council? So I think just to kind of wrap it up, I've been attending, WAC meetings, and I really liked the WAC and thought it did a great job, and it created many studies that have helped all kinds of groups with different ideas and plans to get information to talk about water. And the City Council, this council has committed to protecting the Verde River. We care about the Verde River. It's in our vision statement and our mission statement. The river is very important to us. Something that was sent to me through the WAC by Abe Springer at NAU really helps me, because water models are difficult for some of us that don't have the scientific background. But this was just a guest editorial by John Doherty, and the title is Modeling Picture Perfect or Abstract Art. And one of the comments in here is the role of modeling in this process is to assess likelihood. This must not be confused with predicting the future. Modeling should constitute a scientific expression of our ignorance rather than a claim to knowledge that we do not possess. When it makes a prediction, a model cannot promise the right answer. However, if properly constructed, a model can promise that the right answer lies within the uncertainty limits, which are its responsibility to construct. And I don't know if you folks at the USGS disagree with that article, but when I read that, it really helped me put modeling into perspective. It's the best information that we have right now, and I really wish that the members of the WAC hadn't reduced their funding, because these are the kinds of studies that funding paid for. We leveraged our monies with what the cities and towns in the county contributed, and then the USGS would contribute some funds to that. The Arizona Department of Water Resources would contribute funds, and we came up with these studies. And our work is not done. There's a lot more to know. There's a lot more data. This is the first round of this model, and we need more information. And to have the WAC kind of implode is just a real issue with me. And so I'm like, bring back the WAC, but I think it's too far gone to do that. But I just really think that we have worked together, and I appreciate the USGS and the work that you've done. And we don't have all the answers, but we want to create answers and find answers that do the best we can for our humans. They're kind of vilified up here a little bit, not intentionally, I'm sure, and our river. And I think that the city of Cottonwood, that's our goal. How can we, I say I'm a mayor of people and nature, and I think our council is too. How can we continue to search for the answers to how we can protect our river and provide for the needs of people? So we don't have the answers yet, and we'll continue to seek them. So I want to thank you very much for your time and coming up here today. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say thank you for the opportunity to come up. But, you know, as I said, we are public servants. It's our job to collect information and provide that information for the aid of decision makers and managers. So we appreciate the opportunity.
We'll continue to do our best to work with you and find more answers. So
appreciate that.
Thank you. So do I hear a motion to adjourn? So moved.
Second.
Okay, the Vice Mayor made the motion and Mr. Garrison seconded it. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.